Welcome to the Indian Nations Conservation Alliance podcast, where Native voices lead the conversation on conservation, stewardship, and our responsibilities to the lands and waters that sustain us. Across Indian country, our homelands carry stories of relationship, resilience, and knowledge passed down through generations of people who live with the land and listen to what it teaches. Through conversations with tribal producers, ranchers, conservation leaders, elders, and community partners, we share the teachings and experience that continue to guide how we care for the water, the land, and the living systems that surround us. Together across Indian country, we recognize the spirit carried in our waters, our homelands, and our ecosystems, and we honor our role as caretakers for those yet to come. We begin today by honoring the land, the ancestors, and the knowledge holders who carried teachings long before research institutions existed. We acknowledge that Indigenous knowledge systems are rooted in relationships, responsibilities, and lived experience. Today's conversation centers on Indigenous research methodologies, how critical thinking and how research itself can serve as a practice of cultural understanding. We are honored to welcome Dr. Ren Freeman, whose work through Indigenous research leadership helps bridge academic spaces with Indigenous ways of knowing. For many Indigenous communities, research has historically been extractive. Today, Indigenous scholars and community researchers are reshaping research to be rational, relational, ethical, and culturally grounded. Indigenous research centers plays an important role in supporting this shift. Dr. Ren Freeman serves as a director within the Indigenous Research Center at Salish Kootenai College, and her many work as a researcher surrounding Indigenous themes, and contributes a research coordinator and co-principal investigator on multiple projects. Her work focuses on strengthening Indigenous research design, protecting community knowledge, and promoting culturally responsive scholarship. Dr. Freeman, can you share a bit about your background and the journey that led you into the Indigenous research leadership?
Sure. Thank you, Emmett. I appreciate this opportunity to, just visit with you about what I think is becoming vitally important to understanding as well as learning to apply, and that is how do we work in good ways, with what we call Indigenous perspectives and specifically knowledges. I think I have always had these intentions, these ways of moving in the world through my worldview as an Eastern Shoshone woman, coming from Udadi, which means warm valley in my language, in Wyoming, and that is in the Wind River Reservation. So growing up there and being in the family that I'm, so grateful to have been born into, really helped me to understand the importance of environment. We have so many stories where we can think about, where did I learn this? Or, wow, I understand what that is, in animal behavior and plants, sky, stars, water, anything, if we can relate it back to the relationship. And so I think as a background that has been kind of with me, my earliest memories being with family, just going about everyday life and asking questions. I've always been a bit of an inquisitive person, and as a child, always asking questions, and have in my teenage years received a gift with a t-shirt one time when I was in high school with the letter Y on the back of it, and I totally did not get it. I couldn't figure out why is the letter Y on the back of a t-shirt. And my, family friends just laughed, and they said, "Oh, come on. You're always asking why." So it sort of became something about me and my nature early on that really helped me to understand. I can't go so deep as to say my purpose, but it helped me to understand myself and in relationship to my world, my environments, and what interested me. But I think most importantly is our intentions. And that as a background helped me to realize, in my educational academic journey, where particular spaces, disciplines, work would really help me, stay a student, as we say, for life, but also to pass that knowledge through me and become an educator. So, the goal of becoming a PhD as an educator, a professor, was always a part of the plan. But who that helped me to become that journey, I think has been the important part, the most highly beneficial, because it caused me to think about me and my intentions. So to me, as a background, it's like this circle, but even more so, it's like this spiral. When I think about it visually, I start somewhere, and then what's that journey? And that has helped me personally and professionally, to understand what is this thing called research? What is this work, this way? And it's helped me to connect, to get my head around, why is this even important? What has been the impacts, if you will, to my own people? And how is that similar or dissimilar to other peoples and other than humans and throughout the world? Because I've worked throughout the world in my various capacities. And the whole journey, though, has helped me to understand why I believe the way I do, and to be more open um, about how do we learn and why, and what do we do with that information in, what we call good ways.
No, that's amazing. Thank you. That was a good open to the segment. Um, just understanding what Indigenous research is, what it, and then what it means to you personally, and how you show it in your professional careers across boards of research and talking to other students, and just bringing it into the IRC, Indigenous Research Center in general. Just really defining what Indigenous research means and that interpersonal connectedness. When you talk about Indigenous research methodologies, how do you define um, Indigenous research, and what is the differential between Western research approaches?
I think I always felt we needed to see our world and ourselves in the world in different ways, and understanding why we prefer a certain way. We feel more comfortable with seeing and learning in particular ways had always been intriguing to me. And that comes about from, moving in the world and understanding what culture is, how it's created. And when we think about methods, so, academically, we use the word methodologies, and then we have this other word called methods. To me, I had to start like in this very broad way to define all that for myself, and specifically, how do I understand it as what we call a practice, a way of doing. And throughout my travels, being in the generosity of other Indigenous scholars has, it's meant everything to me, because that's the way we learn best, is in relationship, in community, because you have the opportunity to listen and share. And so there's this exchange versus, just being taught to, in terms of at. And so being taught with has been key. So communicating, well, what is a methodology anyway? And when you come inside the world of academia, something I realized right away is everybody wanted to get to how we're going to do this, and that never sat well with me, because again, how I grew, how I learned about my world always had why associated with. What's my intentions
Just
here?
like the shirt, yeah.
Exactly. So it fit me perfectly. My family and friends, they really knew me. They know me. And so I put that, you've used this term, and I know I created a presentation a few years ago called Understanding the Spaces Between Methodologies and Methods, presented it with the National Science Foundation, and other funding and research groups to understand a difference here. And I think that coming to, well, why is that important, has everything to do with worldview. Methods as the way to do something, and what we would call the tools. Are we going to ask questions? How are we going to do that? You really need to understand why first. And that's where theory comes in. But theory already starts talking about the how. I think philosophy is where we start. That's very personal. That engages so much of what has happened. And that's where I develop my own kind of space of inquiry about what's the past, present, future as an embodiment, as an activity to understand our world. And what do we do with that knowledge then? That's intention. So methodologies, how I define, and my work and what I teach, how I teach, is understanding the philosophy around knowledge. And that's very personal. And that's methodologies. It's this bigger picture that's so deep and complex, but it requires us. And when we apply that over to how do we do this work then? And how is it different from what we call the Western academic or more Eurocentric way, from an indigenous way? And I rarely use indigenous methodology. It's always plural, because we have to respect ways of knowing and worldviews that in our speak in this way. It's about context. Who are you? Where are you? What's that relationship? So we talk about place and space. So philosophy is about building relationships, about acknowledging relationships already exist. And when I began to get the understanding inside myself as a process, that's when I realized, well, there's a system here. How do we know as a way of doing then? And that's where methodologies began to make sense as a necessity in the work of inquiry, and it engages self. And so some scholars agree, myself included, as a place to start is as an individual to understand methodologies is, where am I? So I work, and you're familiar with this as having been my student and you're my colleague, and is, what is this self in relation to self? What is that? And that's deep, and you define that, and it's about intentions. And then it moves forward in a journey of connection to self in relation to me, to you, to, and you can name it. It's just almost infinite. But it begins this process of building connection, and in a system way in research, methodology creates the understanding and means to how we should do something and go about. And this really bumps up against academic process a lot, because in a very systematic way, we're like, okay, are you going to interview, and is it going to be survey? It's going to be a script. Is it going to be what elder scholar Maggie Kovac, she's First Nation scholar, said? What we actually do in our Native communities is we talk to each other. We have conversation. So her work introduced, instead of interviewing, quote unquote, why can't we just talk to each other? And the pushback in academia about that method, but it's a methodology too. It's a philosophy of sitting down together and building trust and relationship. But as a method, it says, okay, how am I going to do this? Well, there's information I, as the researcher, really want to listen for. And how do I filter out all this other info? Well, right there, I say, why would you want to filter that out? Why not have it sit here beside the conversation, and you'll begin to see patterns. You'll begin to see the story in the information.
Right.
And that changed everything when we, as educators who are indigenous with these worldviews, began working in these ways. And it really created this major shift within academic research, because it wasn't going per a formula necessarily. And we use this word congruent. What makes sense in a logical flow, if you will. And through my own master's work, that's where I began asking these questions. One of my primary mentors and good friend today, Sean Wilson, who is a First Nation scholar, we came together, and as he was helping me to understand what am I interested in, how and why, I asked to adapt some of his work in his work Research as Ceremony, where he looks at processes of knowing and building relationship, and key is relationality and relational accountability. And I kept bumping up with methods. Well, how we go about it kept taking priority. I says, that just really doesn't sit well with me. Methodologies, the philosophies, the intentions, the relationship beginnings have to lead into, well, how are we going to be in this relationship? And that's the doing. And he said, so you're questioning congruency here, right? I says, yeah. Even further in academic research, we come to this, well, how are we going to interpret? So whether we work what we call quantitative ways, where we're looking for numbers, or qualitative, where we're looking for the story and the narrative. I work in mixed methods because we need the stories behind the numbers. So that's my own personal process and philosophy of doing research and projects. So if you come to that point and you're looking at information, you're playing back this interview, you're looking at our conversation for patterns around themes and understandings. We're trying to interpret, and in a very science way. And I am a Indigenous STEM scientist, as well as a four-field Indigenous anthropologist. So I work with mixed methods. I evaluate, I assess, I analyze. But often we're told, hey, work in this way, work with R or T, or, and some of it's very highly technical. Work with narrative analysis. You get all these evaluation, analytic, assessment tools. Well, if those are not designed and worked with in terms of its relationship and congruency with the philosophy, you're going to get this very disjointed result. And understanding, it's not going to flow together.
Right.
It won't make sense. And so as I was just learning, I reviewed lots of studies. And I was like, you can see it. It's so obvious. So it has to start with methodologies. moving into. And that whole space between methodologies and methods is key because that's the whole process.
Right.
You're developing relationship understanding so you can choose appropriate methods, right? And in that methods is the interpretation and analysis to tell the story of what you were working on. It came to the point of where I was really having almost these existential issues when I was doing my master's work because I could not find a way to analyze my information that helped me carry through the philosophy. And then Sean said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And he was looking at me in this certain way, wanting me to share, admit the obvious. I said, "Well, I got to find something that fits." He goes, "Well, you've been looking." And we found one study in the entire world at that time where an Indigenous scholar attempted to design their own analytic method. And I looked at him and I said, "No, I don't have time. I cannot design my own analytic method." And he goes, "Well, you got to walk your talk, right? Isn't everything you've been doing so far talking about that relationship in research and method?" I'll tell you what, I had to take the summer off and soul search. And when I went home to the Wind River and to my community, it was there that clarity came. And I am part of Sundance family, gratefully born into that. And, you know, taking time that I take every year to just be with, you know, nature and understand things. And sometimes you call it a fasting period. It was during that time I understood what I'm trying to do is reason with the information, putting the story together from the philosophy through to everything to, okay, here I got all this information. How do I make sense of it? That's reasoning. It's not analytics alone. And then I realized, I look at the world. I can't help because I did try to look at the world as a non-Shoshone woman and non-Sosoi wife. And I was like, that's just not possible.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I can go to other communities, other cultures, and learn languages and such. But, there's something inherent, I think, in no matter how we're born and raised that never leaves us. And that was my first realization. And I said, so I can't help be this way, see the world through that lens, if you will. And what does that even mean? So culture being a socially constructed activity and presence and way of being for me, I had to understand what that is and return to the stories of how was Shoshone culture. What does it mean to say, oh, that's Shoshone way? I needed to understand that in different ways and came to the work of my elders and our community educators back home and the values. What makes this a Shoshone way of thinking, of doing, of being? And to understand that, and we have a number of culturally agreed to values among my people that lots and lots of us have worked to create, just as a place to have a conversation around this. And, at that time I did reach out and I asked, can I work with some of these values in the work I'm doing? So I submitted myself, to the permission, the protocol. I said, I really need to reason with this. And in the course of it, named my analytic method Nua, reasoning. Nua is a Shoshonean word that means we people. It's a collective, it's a plural for Shoshonean speaking people. And there's 54 bands of us right now in this part of the world. So come from a big family, cultural family, and understanding that. So I ended up creating that tool. It started my master's work, in working through that process of what is methodologies and why is it so hard. I almost wasn't given my master's degree because of the system
Right.
in academia. Luckily, I had this amazing chairperson on my committee, he not being native himself, but he'd worked with Indigenous and in creative ways. He's an anthropologist, a linguist, and I wanted to be four-fielded, so I did all the extra work required because philosophically I couldn't silo myself as an anthropologist because they're all interdependent.
Right.
So I needed to do that. He understood, and he told me one time, because I don't know exactly what you're doing, but I believe in it. And he stood by me, and we had to appeal to the department and other folks. I sort of set a challenge because I chose the other two committee members in my master's program to challenge me. One was a very hardline archaeologist. That was very hard.
Yeah.
Working in that and those ways of doing Western, and then the third person was sort of in that middle space, and his name is Dan Swan. He's retired from University of Oklahoma. That's where I got my master's, and I worked for the university, in education programs, developing them and such. But boy, did that challenge me. And I felt that's what's needed, right? For us as Native people in academia, especially, is we need to understand their perspective. So I know anthropological theory upside down and out. I needed to in order to defend what I was bringing inside that realm, right? So right then and there, they said, "Oh, you could be a professor," and I was like, "Really? But what about I teach from a worldview, from a cultural lens?" Well, yeah, you can do that. And so I just sort of found my way. But the whole point was I was building a way that we can understand worldview inside the formal work of research. And I chose anthropology because, to use the word egregious, oh my goodness, I think a lot of what as Indigenous people, the effects and affects of colonization that are persistent today in various forms, man, it's come through that realm, of inquiry and knowledge and all the friction and results through that discipline. If anything, I feel called to be an Indigenous anthropologist. When I first started sharing that at conferences and such, people, "Oh, you study Native people then, right?" And oh, I got offended. I'll tell you what, I had to have to step back, take a breath, because that violates him just being humane. So along this journey, it's so complex, and I think for any of us hoping to even share our story and be educators, we have to have it make sense in our own mind in terms of how do we move, in these ways. And so understanding those spaces between methodology and methods and how they are similar to or different from other knowledge systems. So I work with the understanding there are three primary knowledge systems in the world. There's the Western, and its basis in what we call science method. It's much more ancient, though. Little nerd group I'm with globally, we look at this, torture ourselves with trying to understand that. And then what today we call indigenous methodologies or indigenous ways, knowledge systems. And then also Asian. My interest in Mongolian culture and history and such really took me to that understanding. And why? Why do we have these as these broad umbrellas? And who are we at the micro level, at our local community level? So it fits in terms of we got to do self work. And that as a subjective work versus objective, especially in sciences, is something that I think is probably the most necessary understanding that we have as educators. Why is there resistance to other ways of knowing? What happens when we do that? So I think in terms of how is this different from Western? Oh, there are so many books written about this.
Yeah.
And we all have our stories. Those of us who believe in what we call applied ways of knowing, and that's where understanding the theory and the stories, and then we experiencing them. So it's about experience.
When we think back, I want to reflect on a couple of things that you said, and that was just returning to your community, sitting with the storytelling, being a part of your own ceremony, your own land-based knowledge. When I say your own, I mean your own indigenous culture, the Shoshone, the Nua, and understanding how that was affected your research design in creating your own indigenous research methods and methodologies. Um, you name that IRM2.
Mm-hmm.
IRM2 is a really, really significant to me as a researcher, and I think to Native students as a researcher, that are being able to voice our own storytelling that are coming from our own indigenous communities. And just being a researcher, a young, starting my career in it, and seeing the challenges of bringing in that empirical data, of showing our elders' voice and it being top tier as a PhD,
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that was really tough too, to see from an indigenous perspective to Western academia. Like, I hold our elder stories as PhDs, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to get it recognized in Western academia is a fight itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what roles do storytelling and ceremony and land-based knowledge play in indigenous research design?
I think it comes down to identity at first. And, I think that's a reality we face when we say, I belong to this people, or I don't to any. And you hear that. I hear that a lot. I have a very, very brief story. I was headed out to a Tucson research station one time. This was many years ago, and getting on a bus with other, researchers, and sat next to a lady, and we use the word phenotypically, her skin color, eyes, how that appearance is. I, thought, oh, she must have Irish, Scottish, maybe ancestry. And we sat there and started to get to know each other. And she was very excited. She had recently moved into an apartment in Tucson. And she goes, oh, I've been decorating with Southwest tribal motifs. And I have these moments, and I'm better at it these days, but the question is still there. But I said rather point blank and direct, where are you in your apartment? In terms of photos, colors, schemes, etc. And she looked at me and just kept blinking her eyes. And I said, well, okay. And I explained, I said, you appear, to have, Irish or Scottish on my father's side. He's Cree, First Nation Cree, originally from northern Manitoba, and we have French and Scottish lineage. And so it's something that I was learning about, etc. But she then understood and explained to me, which is a common story, is she didn't really know. Some of that family knowledge had been lost for various reasons. She knew that her grandparents had arrived to the U.S. She herself was second gen, American. But beyond that, she really didn't know much. And so we sort of left it, over that next couple of weeks. We were at the research station. We got to know each other more. And I shared with her, I says, as Native people in this country of the U.S., we also have an identity crisis because of various, federal policies, colonization. Understanding who we are and where we come from is a difficult thing as years go by because of how we say, I am of this people. Well, what does that mean? And you must engage the cultural conversation. And understanding all that, well, there's been so many breaks in that because of federal policy. Lots and lots of people not raised in the community of the people they identify as being part of and being, and for various reasons have no connection with the land that has created the culture through the relationship. So the initial understandings, for years I did some youth camps, and I would ask the youth, okay, we understand this, and a favorite story is choke cherry picking. Why do we do that here? And a lot of this activity was back home on the Wind River. And the youth, I learned this from my mom and grandparents. And so, okay, where'd they learn that from? Their grandparents. And they kept going back, but it was that human centering of their story and source of knowledge that I wanted to understand how prevalent that was. And then I introduced to them, I says, someplace long, long time ago, one of our people was observing maybe a bear. Our physiology, etc., is very kin to bears, and watching them eat berries. And I says, I grew up with a story where watching bear eat chokecherries, but they'd spit the seed out, and so sometimes though they would take it, but they wouldn't quite chew. And you can see in what we call their scat or their poo, they were eating berries, but the seeds weren't chewed. Why? Why that? And chokecherries. Today we know, well, the casing on those chokecherry seeds contain a chemical called cyanide. It's dangerous and it needs to be prepared, and we need to do it different. So we know, and animals. So in my own family stories, I'm like, so an ancestor observed this bear eating these berries. I think the most courageous people throughout time were those who tried a new food first. I mean, you only had 50 chance of living, and it was such an unknown. So, there's so much value in that courageousness. But I got the youth to think like that. And I says, okay, so because we Shoshone people, we tend, that's in our areas, and we moved around a lot, but berries were huge in our food sources, and watching who ate them, when, why, etc. is very key. And we built that relationship observance. We ate those foods. And it became a way of preparing them based on our environment. And, where we are, it determines how we're going to dress and what we eat and how we move and when, etc. So that's what relationships, that's what creates culture. And the practice of these ways creates identity based on culture. So when we put that information as a system, and we can identify and connect those dots, it builds our story. So who am I? My identity. It was important for me to understand when I say I'm Shoshone, and anthropological, the label, those are labels. Our name for ourselves is soul story, people of long grass and bigger stories, but we all have that. And other peoples tell stories of seeing and being with my peoples, and I learn from that. So we need each other. But understanding the importance of identity in this whole work, I think, is key to understanding why is it important to have a relationship. And for me, and kind of resisting some of these policies of, federal enrollment policies and etc., I said, at the very essence, aren't aren't we saying when we say we're from a people that we're a cultural citizen of them or not? Boy, that's hard to say, but to me, it's taken a critical look to understand the dynamics of that. So when I say I'm Shoshone, what do I mean? Well, I mean, I have a blood right to say that's who I am through my mother. And I know, going as far back as our memories, my people have been Shoshone on my mother's side. Okay, all right. I don't need a paper and this, percentage of blood. Tell me so. Our stories, my family, our names tell me that. Okay, all right. But does that mean I'm culturally a Shoshone person? Wow, what does that mean? And so it circles right back to how do we understand then? And was I given the opportunity to know some of that? Is it almost inherent in terms of being a community member? I fortunately, and in my young life, I began to realize I'm a bit privileged because when we have a statistic of 78% of people identifying in this country as being Native American, 78% of them do not have a cultural relationship with the peoples they identify as. And some of it, so in a legal sense, well, when you become aware of that, you have decisions to make. And that's very personal. Are you going to go and be with the land and understand, how is it your people are who they are and you are part of that. So there's a responsibility, and to me that's accountability. If I'm going to say I'm this person, I need to understand what does that mean. And to me it doesn't engage judgment, although there's some movements, in understanding pretend Indians and all this other work that's occurring to understand identity for so many reasons. But I think on the personal level, that's what we need to understand, I think, first, is before I can work in appropriate ways with culture and cultural knowledge, I need to understand what's my relationship with all that. Do I identify as a cultural person with the people? Or am I ancestrally, or whatever word you want to say? I always have a debate with people say, oh, you're a descendant of Shoshone. I'm like, I'm living. I am a living Shoshone person who descended from people who are also Shoshone. I redefine everything. And this, Emma, as part of my own teaching, I'm always like, okay, well, define that, even redefine this. I think it's necessary. Otherwise, we repeat theories and repeat practices that skip over important aspects of description. So that's why I coined for myself cultural citizen, just as a means, as a vehicle to say, let me see, who am I? If I'm going to work in these ways. So that's what I kind of educated some of my elders, my clan grandpas, grandmas, who has helped me to understand what is Nua reasoning. What does that mean to think Shoshone? And I think that's that work in some ways we need to commit to. So this is huge when you saying this is who you are and why you're working in these ways. I think we need to understand that in deep ways. Otherwise, we get brought into, I think, some of the prescribed ways of doing our work, seeing our world, that may skip over what critically thinking, processes help us understand. Why is there colonization, and why is it not okay to think like this and work like this inside an academic setting? We get at the heart, and it isn't reduction, trying to find something simple, because as you delve deeper, it gets even more complex. And ethics and accountability are key here, because you working with your people's knowledge and in the lands, you take on a responsibility, and that is part of this whole process when we say I identify as this. A very good work by scholar Dan Walcat. It's a very thin volume called Indigenuity, and he explores some of this. And it's important for us to visit and talk to folks who are publicly writing, because it's a process. They're going through a journey also, trying to understand, why is this important anyway? And it's a movement, what we call IRM&M, Indigenous Research Methodologies and Methods, as a way of knowing, being, doing. It's a journey. And so when we want to move inside established academic realms, we need to understand, what am I doing and why? To me, the bottom line as an educator is, I just want to understand what's available to me as tools, as ways to know. What can I acknowledge as already existing? And
also
when
creating those tools.
Absolutely, creating those avenues, those vehicles, those tools to help me understand. It's a whole big work. When we read something, we call it locating myself and the positionality. Some of these examples, they're so vital for us as individuals get our head around, because we're being asked to be active. Am I going to write this way? If you look inside my own master's thesis, my own PhD dissertation, I locate myself because of the philosophy I have about objectivity and subjectivity. I need to be part of the work. And Eberhampton, Indigenous scholar, archaeologist, he had a think moment years ago when he says, you know what, we're lying if we say our work is objective, because the moment I think as a human being, I'm like, what if it becomes subjective? Even before that, there's nothing. And he and others of his day started this on, if science, method, and objectivity is the realm of truth. Whoa, that shook everything up.
It has to.
It has to. And so as a visible activity, we position ourselves in our work. We place ourselves, what I found in getting my work accepted to be funded and accepted for my degrees in Western academia, was looking at what we call rigor. How valuable is this work? Can we repeat this, in ways? And that's another area. Can only go so far because we are individuals, and it has to be based on this location, who's there, why we're doing this, etc., etc. But in understanding this system, we have to understand where you yourself are, and big in reviewing. So when we talk about who's going to review this work and say it's scholarly, I knew I needed to understand that realm very well. So I worked with internal review board processes and expectations and kind of rewrote some of that. And this is when I was at University of Oklahoma, and I said, I'm inside this. So it's not over there. I'm inside this, and I need to work this way, identify and write this way. And when I submitted these drafts of my positionality statement, the reviewers came back and they really couldn't say much about that, because all they review for is, where does bias exist? And what I found is, if I admit to bias, and throughout the work, and especially writing it, I say, I am this and look through this worldview, and that's the reason why this looks this way, can be interpreted this way. I'm being truthful and transparent, right?
Right.
So when it came back and they were like, you're admitting to bias, right? And I'm like, yes. And I will work, it'll be designed and worked with that understanding. Then testing it, what it revealed to me is when you do this research, this academic work, it provides even more rigor than what's currently asked for.
Right.
Bam, right there. And my committee as the masters, they were like, whoa, okay, well, I guess we got nothing to question here.
Because all it asked for was the bias.
Yeah, and when you understand the perspectives, in this case, Western perspectives, looking at what we're doing and why, what are the questions you'd have left? And so with my dissertation work at University of Montana, when we ourselves can understand what's required of us and look at it through our lens, we can begin to understand how to answer. But even more important, are there ways that exist in the world, regardless if you call them Western or Asian or Indigenous, that are just the way that respects a process of relationship? That's what you should do, right? So in my own dissertation work research, so it was confusing to everybody, myself included, what I wanted to do with my own PhD work, but I needed to exemplify all of this. So I took the model I created in my master's work, used it to design my PhD experience, the whole thing, how I was going to be, where I was going to be, and inside that, design my own research project. So what I was doing was doing a proof of concept, right?
Right.
And I was going to do continuous improvement because I was doing it this way to understand how to do it better. And I was contextualizing it because I positioned myself, Shoshone Way, inside it and whomever else I was working with.
If you do think about it, that's the way we've been working for years with empirical data. Is very simple. Is what worked. Let's not do what didn't work. And we've been doing that. But that the proof of concept is the tens and thousands of years we've been proofing it over and over, and taking that old concept, and it's not old, but like taking that concept and then just bringing it into Western academia.
That's context.
And
that's it.
Moving in from methodologies to methods and constantly fixing, as we're moving forward. Is genius work. I really enjoy how we're indigenizing Western academics.
And that right there was a personal journey of mine too, is all the work around what we call decolonizing. That was a response to impacts. And I began working with something called affect. How have we persisted in the impacts, right? Okay, so affect, it becomes a way, almost like the example I read recently and had discussion about was, with fish in the water, and I'm leading a book club looking at the Klamath River dams and removal and the salmon. So much of what today we're almost asked to do is, okay, admit the water's murky. Admit we need to develop, the morphology, we need to evolve to swim in that water and still live. And maybe, possibly even thrive. And thrive isn't a word that we hear often enough about. But let's flip the whole deficit model then. And I heard some elders, First Nation elders, say they had trouble with this idea of decolonizing. And I was present at a conversation where the elder just kind of stood there and was thinking. It was like inside themselves, and they says, I'm not a colonizer. I, I'm not. So why do I need to decolonize? That's their work. What do I need to do? I'm indigenous. I need to indigenize. I'll tell you what, it changed my life. I was like, there we go. There we go. And I was just at the start of my master's program. It changed everything. That's where I began to understand who am I as Shoshone. If I'm going to indigenize, I got to define that, right? And you work, and that's where the idea of contextualizing, me as a Shoshone here in Salish country, I need to understand what that means. Even back home, do I move as a Shoshone woman in my Shoshone homelands? What does that look like and why? So understanding those type of relationalities helps us also to understand what knowledges and protocols, when I'm in community, again, being the why person, and especially with language and our knowledges in very distinct ways. And they know me enough back home, I will ask these questions when I hear, you can't work with this knowledge. And that was told to me. Out of then 18 Shoshonean values, I was able to work with 9. And I want to know, why not these others? I had actually asked for 12 values to, in my speak, operationalize. And a couple of the reasons, I was just like, okay, how do I respectfully ask this? And what it came down through conversation was they didn't really understand why we can't work with that knowledge today when it seems very necessary, but it had always been our way not to. It was knowledge only for certain eyes and ears, and just me, in as respectful a way as I could, engaging the conversation of their own discovery was so vital and important, because they are tapped to be our culture committees. They are tapped to be the people we rely on to tell us who we are culturally. And in these cases, they sit on our research review boards. They sit in all these various capacities because of what they know. And then, though, what I have found in my work, because I work, it became a focus. When I'd ask, how do you know this? And why? And why do you say yes or no for its use? What's that based on? Is it still relevant, or are we in a season of where now we can work in these ways because we need to? But the key is knowing why. And what I found, the elders, the knowledge holders, who I think are searching also for those answers for themselves, they were very transparent and honest, and they says, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know, but I need to find out. I've had some of those folks leave the committees I've created, and different, because I ask them, you don't need to tell me details of your knowledge. I just want to understand that you know. Why can you say this word at this time or not? And why this knowledge of a plant and the water or anything can or cannot be part of what we need today. I think through various important projects and work, we're needing to answer those questions. That do we still hold that because of the harm? TEK took a huge hit early on. It was just a facade for appropriating knowledge again. Something that's hard for us as we share knowledge, and this has happened to a lot of us time and again, is we'll present something, we'll provide slides, we'll share stories. Someone will take that knowledge because we're sharing it, but they they will interpret it and often twist that information, and especially ways of doing, for their purposes and in ways that I wouldn't agree with. I'm one of these people, things being said about me or associated with me, it always comes back. My grandma used to say, oh yeah, that little they visit you frequently. And now and again, I have to go talk to other faculty and say, hey, thank you, you invited me. But I have heard you're saying I believe or work in certain way, and that's just not true. Do not twist my words or my philosophies to fit you. That's wrong. That's appropriating, and that is also being dishonest with knowledge. That is something, that's an ethics that we need to enforce.
Right.
And that comes to everything, working. You say you want, right now there's a national park I've been associated with all my life, asked to pull together knowledge holders so we can rewrite what's being shared through our cultural lens of this landscape. My main purpose was so they would hire our own people to come and tell those stories. What they did was take our knowledge as educators of our people and that landscape and told it through their eyes and views.
And sold it as their own.
Oh my goodness, it's a fight. It's in research, it's in workplace employment, it's in everything. So it requires this diligence. And I think this, being vocal. If you want to know this, I will tell, or one of my people. But, recording and videoing, oh my goodness, it just seems to be, it's required individual ethics, and so understanding very intimately, how are you going to use my words? So when we write up work, but there's these agreements, I get to see, and journalists who reach out to me, they know me now. I'm like, I get to read what you're going to publish, your final draft.
I get the final say.
Yeah, that you've interpreted what I shared in the way that I am sharing it, not your interpretation. About 50% of the journalists will say, then you're censoring my work. I say, no, I'm keeping you honest in this, in the transparency of intention. And sometimes they will continue with their interview, sometimes they won't. That's their call. But at the end of the day, I think that's part of our dilemmas when we identify in these ways, when we want to work with our knowledges, lands, and even saying our, goodness, it goes on, and sometimes it can be so incredibly overwhelming. But why? Why do this? What's the intention? And I think it's all about correcting history, correcting ways to go about this work that I think began in good ways. The origin story before politics, and as Linda Tui Smith says, agendas came in and started weaving through intentions. We have swan songs of, like, Maslow, who created the hierarchy of need, your own people. His swan song was, I was not permitted to identify where that knowledge came from. His career would have ended. He would have been ostracized. And so he went to, as far as he could. But we hear this, Oppenheimer, same way. Alexander von Humboldt. We have Darwin. We have, through time, all of these lauded scholars claiming knowledge that it's theirs, they found. And yet, what we are understanding as various, and especially Indigenous people, follow, trace the knowledge. We have scholars working on an important, vital work with Alexander von Humboldt, his journeys throughout the world. And then he came, and his name, Humboldt, is everywhere as a scientist, as an anthropologist, and made claims to knowledge, ways of knowing. And one scholar that I've had the privilege of working with is still, we're still friends and working together. he traced some of those journeys and connected them with knowledges in location. And where Humboldt never acknowledged, that's where he learned that. And so this work, getting that information out, gets pushback because it disrupts history in the story. But doesn't it correct and make truth more evident? And why can't your story be told from yourself and acknowledged as the source is here and this is how it was developed, etc.?
Absolutely.
So I think that's what we struggle about when we think about Western systems. It's getting better, but this is a movement that's only about 45 years old in terms of that truth telling. But it keeps going, and I think that strong purpose, drives us. But for us, for you, for me, any of us, claiming, embracing our indigeneity and identities, this is the work we need to do as individuals. I shared with you recently, I have to revise this. We're not born knowing what it means to be a community member. Well, I could get very deep about all that in the womb, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it makes a point. There's so much we got to learn, but we got to place ourselves into the context in order to understand self.
Right.
So, that circles back. Well, we need knowledge systems like Indigenous research methodologies and methods, or the other model is just I am. And it's about, there's no discipline, no work that's exempt from that work of self and relation. So I work with business and industries, not just academic research. And that has always been a goal of mine, is how applicable, replicable is this way of thinking and going about this way of knowing, being, doing, and there's nothing exempt.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot to that. I always enjoy coming here and talking with you, Doctor. It's always it's an eye-opening experience. As we kind of come to a close of our episode here, one of the most powerful things that you talked about and explained depthly was self-identity and understanding who we are as Indigenous people. When we introduce ourselves, we're not just talking about our genetic makeup or where we come from. It's not a fun fact about us. It's really about accountability and relationality and where we're coming from and who's ultimately we're responsible for and who's taking accountability for us. That tribal mindset. I really believe that was one of the most powerful things, and bringing that into research and understanding that research can be ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
Today, how research can serve as a relationship building rather than just, knowledge extraction is that relationality that you talked about. I want to bring the idea into the episode theme is how can students and researchers begin to practicing Indigenous research approaches? These are things to just keep in mind. What does ethical research look like from a community perspective? And how can research strengthen cultural continuity and sovereignty? We encourage listeners to approach research with humility, respect, and relational accountability. Support Indigenous-led research initiatives and knowledge sovereignty. Prioritize community relationships over data collection, and recognize that research is about responsibility and relationship when working with Indigenous communities. Dr. Freeman, we raise our hands to you, and thanks for your leadership, your teachings, your dedication to protecting Indigenous knowledge and strengthening culturally grounded research. If there is anything you would like to say in some closing statements, feel free. I really do appreciate you sitting down with us and allowing me to interview on what research looks like as an Indigenous researcher.
Thank you. Thank you. I think time and space that reflects the need to create partnerships. Preparing to do work is vital, and that's where partnerships are defined and created, and then working through that as a relationship. When we finish a project or work, the relationship should not end. And what does that mean? That's that whole ecological message, that humanitarian way of being. I think that's the huge part, because time, my goodness, that's the challenge. But we can redefine time and have it be respectful of what our needs are.
Okay.
So that's it for me.
Thanks, Doctor. It's in the duck 66 on. Thank you for listening to the Inca podcast. This program is supported through grant funding from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, the Rural Climate Smart Initiative, and the Indigenous Grazing Lands Coalition. These efforts help support grassroots producers, tribal ranchers, and the conservation partners working to strengthen stewardship across Indian country as a whole. The views expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA. To learn more about Inca and our work, visit us online and join us for the next conversation. Thank you.